Father, Book 5 of Stories for Your Inner Child, by Steve Gallegos. Chapter 1, Disruption. Father had not been born in this country. He was born on a ship as his parents traveled from Estonia to the United States. The journey was brutal. Winter storms battered the ship, and every passenger was miserable. Shaken and thrown about as the choppy and virulent waves slashed and forced their way above the deck, there was no way to stay dry. Vomit slathered the walkways brought up by people who had tried to hurry to the edge but didn't make it. Not that it would have made any difference, as the sea seemed to be slinging back on board anything that had fallen overboard. The third-class cabin was particularly desperate, deep below decks with narrow walking room and crowded conditions. But the people at that level did what they could to comfort one another. God is giving us full passage. We squeeze through the gateway. Feel your strength, my friend. He only does this to those most fit. He knows how strong and determined we are, so let us enjoy the challenge. They heartened one another with their exhortations and their jibes and the warmth of their caring for each other. It is never easy to leave home. Home is supposed to be a place of warmth and comfort and safety, a place where growing can reach its peak and fulfillment benefits everyone. But there are times and conditions when staying is no longer tenable, and breaking free is the only recourse. Then one must gird oneself and plunge into the unknown, trusting, just like the newly hatched sea turtle, digging itself out of the sand and then scrambling for the sea, takes comfort in a knowing that is deeper and older than this tender carrier of life, and that life has always supported itself in the darkest of times. Reaching deep for that knowing, without even knowing how it is done, is the spark that has always moved us further on. The swelling in her belly seemed to scream for freedom, for release, for its own way, and even though the birth was not supposed to be for another month, she knew it would happen very soon. They had hoped to be in the new country by then. That is why they had undertaken the journey at this time. But the seas and the weather and the might of the ship itself were calling loudly for a birth before its time. Chapter 2, Disaster. The roiling seas seemed to be boiling from beneath the earth. The pitch and yaw of the ship became more and more severe until some of the passengers were thrown off their feet, and one even washed overboard. The captain forbade non-crew members on deck. The passengers below huddled together, not out of desire, but because they were thrown together in great heaps as the ship felt like it was going full to roll over completely. Seawater drenched them, pouring in torrents down the stairwells, and they were all certain that they were going to drown. But to the pregnant woman, this was hardly disturbing. Her focus was on the growth in her belly, deep inside her womb, and she was more than certain that they would all be safe. The new life whose squirming she could feel was solid and accepting. In fact, its acceptance radiated throughout her own body, stilling any concern or doubt, and holding her firm and strong in her own presence. There was absolutely no doubt that they were all safe, and that they would soon land, and that her baby boy, for she knew it was a boy, would be born strong and healthy. The night raged on, with great swaths of seawater drenching everyone. The darkness was completely engulfing, as if they were all drowning in night, and the vast numbers were howling, crying, praying, hoping, and cursing. Only the mother-to-be was deeply still and warm within, and she alone knew that they would come through into a new day. Chapter 3, The New Day. And the new day came in like thunder. It was a glorious day, filled with sunshine and stillness, freshness and new hope. The passengers could not believe that the storm was over. They dragged themselves up the stairs and onto the deck as best they could, bedraggled, wet, and unbelieving, staring up into the sky warmed by the sun, breathing in the warm, moist air and giving praise, each in their own way and to their own deity, that they had survived the unbelievable turmoil. There was such joy and jubilation, such a deep feeling of comradeship and togetherness, for they had survived the onslaught altogether, and if the ship had gone down, they knew they would all have perished together. They hugged and talked and rejoiced and delighted in one another, feeling the strong bond of companionship that only mutual survival can endow. The mother-to-be also came up on deck and was so overwhelmed by the beauty of the day and of the people that she knew this was the perfect day for her son to be born. Chapter 4, The Birth. The body was so full that it greeted the sunshine and the newborn day with its own opening toward birth. The birth of the day drew the body toward imitation, toward a contraction and a squeezing that produced its own opening for new life to emerge. And the opening was generous and full and inviting. The mother-to-be had sought a private corner and was accompanied by 2 older women who knew birth and who had already assisted others and protected the space in which birth occurs. In the shady corner, one of the elders laid herself down on the deck and opened her own arms as a cradle in which the mother-to-be could lie, comfortable and cushioned and held. She felt she was being held by the earth herself, as women who have given birth know the place of joining together so comfortably with the earth that they become the earth herself in her nurturing and holding and rooting of new life. Mothers know the place of giving and providing and trusting. There is a place within them where knowing is deep and arises from the knowing of relationship as the most profound expression of wholeness, so that the newborn can experience wholeness as the source from which they come, and intuitively as the destination to which they must ultimately return. The second elder also provided a cradle with her arms, but a cradle into which the newborn could comfortably be launched into this world and be held by warm and knowing hands and breasts, not all that different from the womb itself, out of which it was being discharged, if it is to continue the transformation into a complete being. These 2 elders knew that place of sacrifice, but they knew it as a place of reconnecting, of giving of who they are into a place of deeper connection, participating in that web of continuity, the fabric that is itself aliveness, and whose orientation is the further support and nurturing of aliveness itself. And so the mother-to-be gave herself to being held, to trusting, to being the portal through which new life would find passageway, and to the ultimate return. Chapter 5, Twins. The belly was so distended and active and insistent that the 2 elders barely had time to arrange themselves, one as the cradle for mother and the other as warm receptacle for the newborn, when the ship suddenly lurched severely and almost capsized. A giant wave, like a gift from the gods, had provided the power that squeezed and opened, and much to the surprise of the elders in their hidden corner, the baby almost jumped forth. But before either elder could remark, there was a second surge, and a second infant emerged. Where only one was expected, 2 suddenly appeared, both boys, squirming and squiggly, and the receiver had all she could do to hold on to them with her strong arms. And with a quiet shriek, the mother-to-be was a mother no more. The outflowing wave seemed to pick her up and take her with it, leaving the 2 midwives looking strangely at each other, and each took one of the infants and silently began to tend to it, knowing profoundly that the great mystery of being had presented itself to their deep wisdom. Chapter 6, Father-Mother. Each of the elder midwives carried one of the infants tightly wrapped in her shawl, hardly breathing, and scurried down the stairwell to the darkest corner she could find. There, hidden away from prying eyes, deeply ensconced in the mystery to which she had been privy, and also hidden away from each other, she explored in the darkness with her hands and fingers the contours and secrets of the newborn. As any mother would do, even though she was not the mother but the mid-mother, she explored to discover whether the newborn was intact. Sighing with relief, each of them in their own way, knew that these were twin boys complete, and not somehow deformed or different. Each knew she had been allowed into a great mystery, and that the mystery must remain forever within her own knowing, and never to be shared. And each also knew that she had been imparted with a knowing that the mysteries of the universe were great and privileged, and that the sea had brought not only new life, but also had taken life, the life of the mother. Only one question remained, and that was a deep one, a question that was to be pondered for the remainder of the life of each of the midwives, pondered and never shared, for in the hurried and dangerous birth, in the hidden corner of the deck of the ship, each had seen that the mother was not only mother, but that she or he also had the power to have been, and possibly was, also father. Chapter 7. The New Land. Going through customs, each of the midwives claimed the child she carried as her own, born on the ship. No questions were asked, as the voyage was considered a miracle that it survived at all. So the migrants were treated with kindness and respect. Each went in her own direction, and the children, identical twins, were given different names, and as far as anyone knew, would never see each other. Each of the mothers carried a new name and was sworn within herself to lifelong secrecy. With one final nod, and a nod that carried more power and understanding than anyone ever knew, the women parted, and each set out upon her own path, feeling that the great universe and the voyage itself had gifted them with an indescribable treasure, but a treasure that would carry a heavy debt. Chapter 8. Disappointment. The journey was not easy. She thought that once the sea voyage was over, nothing could be as difficult and as threatening as that great passageway. But she was in no way prepared for her voyage over land. She had expected her cousin to meet her when the ship landed, but there was no one there. She searched until she was weary. Certainly she could not have forgotten her agreement to meet when she arrived. Cousin Motilda was the only connection she had in this new land. They had been close friends all their lives, being the daughters of sisters and having sworn to be lifelong soul friends. After Motilda had left the old country, she had written regularly about the new land and had encouraged Clotilda to make the voyage as well. Neither had thought that it would be many years before such an encounter were possible. But 1 year had merged into another, until the meeting was held more like a dream of something possible rather than a reality. But there was no way the search could continue. Clotilda had to make do with whatever she could find. She felt lost in a world that she did not know. But she did have the child. It was her link to aliveness and to a sense of deep duty. Without the child, she may well have given up hope. The child was her connection to purpose and to being needed, and she was not about to fail this tender gift from the universe. And so she began by speaking to the child. What should we do? We find ourselves together here in a world that is new, but you are also new, so perhaps you know better than I what our next step should be. Having said this, she felt a deep murmur. Was it within herself, or did it actually come from the infant? She listened more closely. The sound was very tiny, but tremendously distinct, like a fine bell that could only toll if one listened with all of one's being. Knock at the door of this large house and ask if they can help. She did exactly that, and the door opened. The woman who stood inside looked tremendously distraught. The mother stepped inside with her small infant and reached out her hand, touching the woman on the arm. I have come to help you. Tears sprang from the eyes of the woman inside. Thank God, at last. And she fainted away. She was so thin that the mother had no difficulty holding her with one arm as she held the infant with the other. She moved easily to a nearby chair and gently sat the woman down. Chapter 9. Arrival. She looked around, still holding the baby, and also having one arm around the woman. It was a large house, with an entryway carpeted with a long red Afghan runner, large double doors that led to rooms on either side, and a curving stairway leading to the upper landing. The house had been wealthy at one time, but the Afghan, sturdy as such a carpet is, was rather threadbare down its center. A worn woman's coat hung on the hall tree, and the entryway had not been recently dusted. The house exuded wealth that no longer existed, and the old oak flooring was well worn. The seated woman began to stir, looked around as if dazed, then looked at the woman and her child, and a dim recognition began to return. "Oh, I'm so glad you've come," she said. "You have no idea how long I've been waiting." There, my lady, I'm here now. Your worries are over." She had no idea where these words came from as she spoke them, but she felt deeply that she was the person, even perhaps she and the child were the awaited ones. Chapter 10. Dazed? It was hard to know if the woman was still dazed or perhaps was a bit senile. She grasped the hand that held her warmly and reiterated how glad she was that she had arrived. The woman, still holding the baby, said nothing, but just gazed deeply into her eyes. She felt there a deep, ancient connection, a feeling that knew, a meeting and understanding that extended beyond understanding, beyond any thought or idea, a knowing that both entered a realm and also emanated from that same realm, a realm that had held them both and was greater than either of them. She was led to a room that was simply but freshly appointed, with a bed of her own and even a crib for the baby. She did not know what to think. Had she been mistaken for someone else? Was she accepting a welcome in a place that belonged to another? Was the house owner in fact a bit doughty, or perhaps even psychotic? But the feeling in her was profound, a sense of belonging, an experience of having been guided, or perhaps even having been summoned by the old woman. Once she had settled her bag in the room and put the sleeping baby in the crib, she came downstairs to see a plate of warm biscuits and a cup of hot tea waiting. "You might think I'm a bit insane," the house owner began, "but I assure you I'm not. My sister died 3 years ago. She and I had lived in this house forever. You see, we were both born here. We were identical twins and had both always loved this house with its large sunny rooms and warmth and happiness. Our parents were killed in an accident when we were both in our teen years. It was an unexpected shock, and we did not want to leave the home where we'd always been at home. So we decided to stay here. We had no idea that we would both grow old here, and we were happy as we had been as children, and our parents left enough money so that neither of us had to work. Somehow we thought we would live forever, or else that we would die together. You see, we were very, very close. But we never thought about being so alone when the other died. In fact, I'm not really sure whether it was she that died or me. Somehow we both died on that strange day." "The day had begun like any other," the old woman continued. "We arose and opened the blinds to allow the sun to shine in. We had both always loved the sunshine so, and we had developed this strange little ceremony, or at least some people may have considered it strange, but for us it was an expression of joy at the new day, and we each felt ourselves beaming inside just as the sun was beaming outside. We had always felt that way, joyful just to be alive, to breathe in a new day, to welcome the simple pleasure of another day together. We had no idea that that would be our last day together, or at least together alive. My sister had just stepped out to go to the grocer's to buy some flour. We always baked our own bread, and in the morning we would make scones and have them with tea. But on that particular morning we discovered we were out of flour, and making scones together had become such a usual ceremony that my sister announced she would just run down to the grocer's only 2 blocks away and get a bag of flour. She had no sooner stepped out the door when suddenly there was the strangest ruckus. I had turned around to go prepare things in the kitchen, but when I heard the noise I ran back, opened the door, and saw that a carriage had struck my sister just as she had stepped out. She didn't have a chance. She was killed immediately. I never even had a chance to say goodbye. Since that time I've felt this tremendous loss, as if half of me is missing. I picked her up and carried her inside. Others ran for the doctor. The driver of the carriage entered as well, helping me to lay her on the couch and expressing his deepest regrets. He said she had not stopped to look and had stepped directly in front of his carriage, so suddenly that he had wondered if she had not done it deliberately. I assured him that there was no way she would have done it from her own intention. The only solace I had was that she had been so deeply happy as she left to go purchase the flour. So I knew she had been happy when she died, and she did even have a smile on her face. I'm sure she never even realized what was taking place before she was suddenly gone. The strange thing is that the day before she had told me about a dream. In the dream, a visitor had arrived. The visitor had brought with her an entire family, father, mother, and children. My sister said that in the dream she had been looking out of the window and had seen this family growing out of the earth like trees or a small forest. But as they grew, they stepped out of the earth, leaving their roots behind, and they had feet and legs. And when she looked at them more closely, she saw that they were a family. The family walked up to our door and rang the bell, and when we opened it, they entered as if they knew us and knew the house, and they said to us, "We are your family. We have come to you out of the earth, for the earth provides everything. And we are here because the earth felt your need for a family and grew us just for you." My sister said she didn't know what to think about such a strange dream. And yet, she said, it felt deeply warming and beautifully good. What a strange dream for her to have had just before she so suddenly died. And yet her dream had left a warmth in me in spite of her death, and I somehow felt that her death was the first step in the arrival of this curious family that had grown out of the earth. Well, today was the 3rd anniversary of my sister's death, and last night I had a dream myself. In the dream I saw a seed that had fallen into the earth under very strange circumstances. The earth had been very well prepared. It had been plowed, and the soil was very rich, and nothing had grown there for 3 years. And then I saw a seed deep in the earth, and the seed had suddenly sprouted. In fact, it had sprouted a few days ago and was just now nudging its way up out of the earth. And it emerged and stood proudly in the sunshine. And the sunshine felt so good, so deeply good and warming, and it reminded me of the beautiful sunshine my sister and I had experienced on that morning just before she suddenly died. When I awoke, the first thought in my mind was, I wonder if today is the day that the family will arrive. Well, I busied myself with breakfast, as I always do, and yet the dream was so strong, and I felt the presence of my sister so deeply that several times I turned around expecting to see her coming down the stairs. Just as I finished breakfast and washing up the few dishes that I had used, the doorbell rang, and suddenly here you are. Chapter 11, 2 Mothers. In no time at all, the 2 women had become fast friends, and it felt to the mother as if this really was her home, and that she had always belonged here, even though she had been born in a country far across the sea. And the baby brought a lovely joy and warmth to the house, and adapted to it as if he had been born there. Both women doted over him. It seemed he really had two mothers, and that they both loved him dearly. His true origin was never revealed to the homeowner, who continued to think that the other woman was his birth mother. When she was asked his name, she had spontaneously blurted out Hubert, which she pronounced in the French fashion as Hubert. She really didn't know where the name had come from, nor why. The homeowner had difficulty with the pronunciation, and after a few attempts and some questioning, shortened it to Hubie. His mother found this completely acceptable, and it seemed to her as if his name had been born from the two mothers spontaneously. Hubie was a precocious child. He learned quickly, and he developed a daringness that both confused and delighted his two mothers. For that is what he came to call them when language began to appear. And they were curiously similar. In fact, the homeowner quickly began to call the mother by her sister's name. She did this initially by accident, but it also seemed to fit, and it became their standard practice until it seemed like the sister had not died, but had only been gone a short while. Strangely, it felt like she had gone to fetch Hubie from the other side and then returned. Chapter 12. New Parents. This ideal situation, having two mothers who absolutely doted on him, was admittedly a strange outcome for a baby born at sea under circumstances that were unusual, to say the least, given the storm that had seemed to squeeze him forth into this world, the almost mysterious lack of a father, if he had in fact ever had one, and a twin who had been carried off in a different direction. But naturally the situation was not going to last forever. In fact, it was not going to last very long at all. He had only been in the new home for a few months when ever-nosy neighbors began to suspect that there was something foul afoot. Speaking to other neighbors across the street and on the other side of the once stately home, the surrounding homeowners somehow evolved the theory that this new baby appearing suddenly and without a father had been kidnapped. The suspicions were voiced surreptitiously to a niece who happened to work for a social agency. And as we know, once a social agency enters the picture, all hell can break loose. And it did. For as we know, social agencies usually function on a mandate. Not only that, but they're usually horribly understaffed. And the supervisory staff tries to make certain that their own division lies above reproach. Therefore, pressure is placed on the underlings, that is, pressure in addition to an overly large client load and overwork. And this pressure is bound to appear at any cracks in the armor or capacity of the social worker. And so the case of Hubie was investigated, judged, found to be lacking in firm answers as to the name of the father, the name of the mother, the relationship to both mothers, and other entries on the official forms required by the state. And Hubie was promptly removed under a high degree of suspicion, but no definitive answers. He was placed in a home with a childless couple who had tried diligently to have children, only to constantly come up empty. And they were delighted to have a baby to practice on, for since there were no ties of birth or blood, they went earnestly into most of the books on child-rearing, and memorized the theories then in vogue. They quickly learned that they are not to give in to Hubie's demands, nor to his cries from the bed at night, for they had learned these were only attempts by the child to control his parents, and that if they ignored him he would eventually fall asleep and become a good and obedient child who could take direction from his parents without developing an overburdening presence of his own. And like all children raised in such circumstances, he quickly became a beautifully obedient child, but with a hidden, seething anger that was dutifully buried and hidden. His new parents were very proud of their achievement and put Hubie regularly on display to neighbors and friends, and seemed extremely loving, at least in the face of company. At home there was a decided coldness and emptiness in their lives, in spite of having a child of their own. That is, until his new mother discovered that she was now pregnant. Chapter 13. Pregnant. There was such a flurry of excitement in Hubie's new home that he had no idea what had happened. The usual dullness and ignorance that had previously pervaded the space was replaced by activities and a sense of urgency that was overwhelming. Except that now somehow Hubie seemed to be in the way of something important that was taking place. And so not only was he ignored whenever he needed something from his parents, he felt that he was brusquely shoved aside whenever he voiced anything at all. And the excitement and new energies that he experienced in his new parents seemed to swirl like a hurricane around him. And he seemed to be the still center in the house. There was something both troubling and reassuring in this new energy. It was troubling because no matter what Hubie did, there was very little response to him, even at the times when his new parents had previously paid him some attention. And it was subtly satisfying because he felt he could now relax in this new still center of the hurricane. Whatever he did not seem to rile or preoccupy these new grown-ups, and he had come into what he would later call the catbird seat, a perch from which he could observe without seemingly being seen. As time went on, he did notice his mother's belly growing larger, and his own bedroom was moved into a smaller room, and the room he had slept in since first coming to these people was being painted and decorated, with a new rocking cradle being bought and a new soft curtains being hung and a new soft rug on the floor, and he still had no idea what was causing all the change and excitement. Chapter 14. Outside. There was also another reward that Hubie gained in the new situation. He was allowed to go outside without having to ask permission. And in the backyard was a large garden and several large trees. He soon became friends with these trees and found that he could talk to them endlessly, without interruption, and without being condemned or fault being found. There was one tree in particular, a large old oak tree, that Hubie became very fond of. And the more he spent time with this tree, and the better he got to know it, the more he longed to be part of it. It was so stable and available, so large and powerful, and he soon found that if he approached it from the side that faced away from the house, there were certain footholds and branches that he could grasp. And before even realizing what he had done, he found himself up in it, sitting on one of the branches near the center trunk. This was the soothingest place of any he had yet experienced with this new family. So he developed the ability to climb this tree quickly and to sit silently in its branches. He soon realized that he was also relatively hidden, and that unless his father was looking up here deliberately for him, he was essentially invisible. This gave him a real sense of power. Not to be seen was the most powerful thing he had yet experienced as a young boy. So it became a place not only in the tree, but also within himself, that he deliberately chose, like a spy within, who could silently observe without himself being observed. So he went often to this withdrawn place and just sat there in deep contentment. Chapter 15. Withdrawn. Hubie went often to this place. He soon learned that he didn't even have to climb the tree. He realized it was also a place within himself, a place of stillness, a place of deep contentment, where he could watch what was going on around him without getting involved. And he would often sit there for hours just watching, but without interacting. It was as if he had a tree within himself that he could climb and be invisible. But he soon discovered that other people seemed to be somewhat afraid of him when he was sitting up in his inside tree. His new parents began to whisper to each other in his presence when he had been sitting in it for a long time. And then they began to poke at him with questions. What was he thinking? Why didn't he answer? What was wrong with him? Maybe they should take him to a doctor. They even began to use new big words around him. One of them was autistic. He didn't know what they meant, but he was determined even more just to sit in his own place of contentment and watch, because if he answered them, then the questions would never stop. More questions would follow, and he would find himself bombarded with their attention and their questions. But their attention did not feel kind, and their questions made him feel like a butterfly pinned to a wall. He felt like they were trying to dissect him, and he felt strongly that if he allowed that, then he would really disappear completely.